Yep. Yeah, thanks for everybody who tuned in. You're kind of going to get a first look at information on 2021 licensing. So lucky you. And then I'll talk a little bit about some production details with grain fiber and cannabinoid production. Some of the information you may have already seen if you've tuned into any of the webinars we've recorded within the last 7 months. But there is some new information on marketing and pricing, as well as some additional resources that have just come online. So we'll get started. Let's see. I'm going to talk a little bit about what 2020 has looked like and then a 2021 regulatory update. So this year so far, when we look at CBD production, we had about 5,400 acres registered specifically for CBD production and about 1.1 million square feet. All of our growers are required to fill out a mandatory survey at the end of the year, so we'll actually get to see what was planted, but this was what was registered in the state. We had about 1,600 acres of fiber production. We have other types of hemp production, including smokable hemp, which I'll talk about more in the regulatory section, as well as CBG, which is another cannabinoid, clones. We have some people looking to capitalize on CBN. There are lots of different minor cannabinoids, so that's about 704 acres. And then we have grain, seed, and seed oil production, which is the minority. That's 615 acres, and we do have some indoor producers that are doing some feminized breeding projects within a controlled environment. So we do have all types of hemp production within the state. We're not just a CBD state. We're seeing more people gain interest in grain and fiber, so I wanted to make sure I talk about those as well. But the majority, as you have seen, is for cannabinoid production. So this is a heat map that the Indiana State Department of Agriculture put together, and I think Bob's going to send out a PDF of my slides, so this link will be active, and you can actually go and select different features within this GIS map. But this just shows grow sites, so this isn't an actual acreage. This is just number of grow sites by county, but it gives you an idea of where the majority of hemp is being grown in the state. We do see, central Indiana kind of the thriving spot so far. We have a lot of CBD producers in the Indianapolis area in Marion County, but that could change as more processors come online, especially with fiber production. If we see a fiber processing facility open up in northern Indiana, we'll see a lot more grow sites in that, those surrounding counties. But this is a free tool that the State Department of Ag put out, and I would, recommend checking it out if you're interested in looking at major spots of production. But that's available to y'all. And then for harvest numbers, we do have an idea of how much of the crop has gone hot now that harvest is primarily over, with the exception of some indoor growers. About 20% of Indiana's crop has gone hot. And for anybody who's new to this, going hot means the THC content was above 0.3% on a dry weight basis. Last year, for comparison, we had about 30% of the hemp sampled go hot. And so we think that the lower percentage is because we really tried to push both on the state chemist and the extension side to test early and test often, to work with third-party labs. So if you are either a current grower looking to continue to grow next year or a brand new grower, keep in mind that this testing is really important so you don't have to destroy your crop. But that's kind of what we're looking at this year. We did have one crop that went what we consider really hot at 13% total THC. So I mentioned that compliancy amount is 0.3%. 13% is like marijuana dispensary quality. So that grower had a really hot crop. They didn't know. They bought seeds from someone who wasn't reputable, and I'll talk about that when I talk about selecting, good seed sources. He's not having any, he's not going to jail or anything. Nope. The state police didn't arrest him, but he was pretty disappointed, because he had planted over an acre of hemp. It was hemp, but it was really marijuana. So we'll talk about that when we are seeking out reputable seed sources, but this is still a problem. Growers are kind of getting duped by seed companies. This is a bar graph of average THC by varieties. The red dashed line is that 0.3% THC compliancy. So you can see that we do have quite a few varieties that are still non-compliant. We have some that are consistently, this is an average by variety, staying below that threshold, which is good. That's what you're going to want to look for going into next year. And I'll talk about that in the license process. But this is specific to Indiana. I do have a cool figure coming up in a couple slides that's specific to the Midwest when we look at THC. These are the most often failed varieties when it comes to THC content. So in general, I'd say try to avoid these varieties. Cherry wine is extremely popular. It's probably one of the most popular varieties across the country. And we've seen it fairly consistently go hot or non-compliant in this state. So this is one that if you really did want to grow it, you're going to have to monitor and probably harvest a lot earlier than some of these other varieties. But this just gives you an idea of how varieties are performing on just a pure THC content basis. So this is a figure that was generated from a Midwest cannabinoid testing database, which I put the link up on the actual figure. It's run through University of Illinois, but it's a collaboration between U of I, University of Wisconsin, Michigan State, and Purdue, as well as Rock River Laboratories and Pride Analytics. So we are working with growers to get a larger amount of testing data across these 4 Midwestern states. And so the testing laboratory we worked with offered a deal to growers where they could get reduced testing costs. So it's $30 a test instead of $60. And they would contribute information on their grow site and management, and then they would get THC and CBD data back from the laboratory. And so this is a figure of several hundred data points generated just from this field season. And on the x-axis, we have total CBD, and then the y-axis, we have total THC. So this is a relationship between the two. And we worked with the University of Wisconsin last year to kind of bring this information to light, but just showing that there's a really strong linear relationship between these two compounds. So as your plant increases CBD, THC generally also increases. So this is a free tool. If you're to go to that link, you can look at specific varieties. You can look at different growing environments, different soil types, irrigation methods. So I'd recommend if you're going to grow next year, check out this tool. You can also specify by state, though Indiana is the least represented. I think Wisconsin had the most growers participate. But this is a really great tool to start looking at variety performance and the relationship between CBD and THC. So again, like this is super important. I couldn't stress enough how valuable it is to know THC data when you're looking at different varieties, because you can do everything right and grow a beautiful crop. But if you fail compliancy testing that the state runs, you have to kind of throw all that hard work away. So this is one of the most important things when it comes to growing hemp, is just understanding the way THC increases in the plant and the relationship between these two cannabinoids. So on the selecting seeds topic, we have a couple recommendations. First, I want everyone to go to the Indiana State Seed Permit license holders, which is that link below that photo of hemp seeds. There are 92 permitted seed distributors in the state right now, which is a lot. You don't have to be an Indiana company to get a seed permit. In fact, if you're going to sell seed in the state, regardless of what state you're in, you have to have a seed permit through the Office of Indiana State Chemist. So first, check out that list and look for a seed license holder. And then once you start to figure out maybe some companies you want to work with, demand to see seed labels, which I'll show you an example of in the next slide, and then demand to see seed report through, a state certified seed lab. That could be a report through, the Indiana State Seed Lab, or any seed lab across the country, any ASCA, certified lab. So those are two really important things. If a seller is not going to provide those to you, walk away. Don't take that risk. Also think for CBD growers in particular, or really any cannabinoid grower, look for data on mature plants. So ask for a certificate of analysis on those mature plants, because obviously, THC content is going to be 0 in an ungerminated, ungrown seed. The THC builds in, maturing plants. So ask to see data on those mature plants. That's going to be really important, especially if it's a variety you haven't heard of or is newer, because we may have limited state testing data on particular varieties because there are lots of new breeders coming online. So that's really important to ask for. And when in doubt, select a variety that does not have a tendency to go hot. Select one that has been grown multiple years, maybe in Indiana and surrounding states, and just opt for those options rather than something like new and shiny. And then talk to, experienced hemp growers. There is a list of licensed hemp growers that decided to not remain confidential, listed on the state chemist website on their hemp page at the very bottom. I think it's the very last section. I've had growers cold call other growers or meet them at meetings, and once they get to talking, they really like to share, kind of their war stories or their horror stories. This is a really good way to find out what companies not to work with when it comes to seeds or getting, propagated cuttings or clones. And then, of course, and we saw this this year, if something sounds way too good to be true, it is. We had that problem with a variety this year called Eclipse, where somebody was saying, it's 0 THC and you get 20% CBD, and this, this amazing variety, and it went hot most of the time. And, we were all skeptical because we hadn't seen certificate of analyses, and, they were talking this particular variety way up and saying it's just amazing, 0 non-detectable THC, and that just wasn't the case. So if anything sounds just like a really strong marketing ploy and it sounds way too good, I'd say walk away, just so you don't have to destroy your crop. That's a pretty sad sight to see. So this is an example of a seed label. This is just one that the state chemist put together, and then there's a link to their document, their PDF, on how to test and label hemp seeds, and has a lot of really great information of what to look for. If you are, any kind of farmer or plant grower and you've worked with even vegetable seed, fruit seeds, anything like that, corn, soy, wheat, you're familiar with seed labels. We see a lot of hemp coming in with, magic marker written on bags. They don't have real seed labels. So this is really important to look forward to the point in this industry where people really need to be putting true seed labels on the hemp instead of, handwriting the variety and that it has 0 THC. This is a THC by variety database that's run through the state chemist. And this is actually going to be available on the licensing software. So when you go through that licensing process, you'll actually be able to pull up this list and look at the varieties that have been tested in the state. So this is just a screenshot of some of the different varieties. If I was a grower and I was interested in producing fiber, I'd look at this Gen Ma. This is a fiber variety, and I'd say, okay, this comes in at 0.68% THC. This is not going to be a compliant variety, so I'm going to avoid it. So this is what this tool really is. It's going to be multiple years worth of data at this point and multiple fields. So Gen Ma, this is 0.68 is an average of all the fields tested for the last 2 years. So this should give you a pretty idea of what to steer away from, especially these ones that are in this, higher THC content. These are ones you want to just avoid altogether. So as far as regulations go, we're operating under the state chemist emergency rule. They'll have a new emergency rule in place in January. But what is really going to happen for the growing season is that we'll have full commercial production because our USDA plan got approved. What this doesn't do is it doesn't make smokable hemp legal. This is not something the state chemist regulates. So if there are people on here who are really interested in smokable hemp, this is something that's still illegal to sell in the state. You technically could grow it as something else, but you can't sell it in the state as smokable hemp. So I just want to put that out there. That hasn't changed since this last August when the state passed that it was going to ban smokable hemp again. There is a group of individuals who are pursuing this again to try to get it legalized. But at this point, I wouldn't bank on that as an option. I would look at some other, possible avenues for your hemp crop. And then if you want to look at the emergency rule or the USDA plan, you go to the OISC hemp site. You can just Google that. And then once you're there, you go to section 1 and you can see the Indiana Hemp USDA plan, but you can also see the emergency rules and other regulatory documents. I would say in general, familiarize yourself with that OISC hemp website. There are, I think, 7 or 9 sections at this point. There's a lot of really great information, some of which I'll continue to talk about and share links with. But you can find, most of what you need to know to get started and feel comfortable, going into licensing and early steps of production by going to this website and going through each section. So for the Indiana State Plan, this is what we're looking at for 2021. The state chemist is still going to test, sample, and regulate hemp. They got approved through USDA though, so it is run through the state. It's not run through USDA. USDA isn't going to come in and have their own people sample the crop. It's going to be, somebody from the state chemist office that's on campus coming out to the field. The state plan is a pretty big document. I think it's about 81 pages. It goes into detail of what is and is not allowed. So I would recommend, if you're going to grow, read through that just so you can see exact language and wording. There are minimum grow sizes, which I'll talk about, but we are not a recreational or kind of like backyard, back porch growing state. They don't allow six plants on the back porch, is what Don says. They're trying to make this a commercial crop, so it is not a hobby crop where you're going to have it in a back garden. Like, I'm not going to grow it in my raised beds in Lafayette. They're still testing for total THC. They did that last year. States like Illinois only test for Delta 9, so they don't include the acidic form of THC. This is a rule that USDA put in place, so if you wanted to get your state plan approved, you had to say you're going to test total THC, but that's not a change from this year or last year, really. And then there are civil penalties that are included in this plan. They just specified at this point, and they're looking at negligent violations, as well as, what do you do if you really break the law under the hemp license and it's past a negligent violation, but they haven't introduced those yet. So I wouldn't worry about that at this point. And then there's federal reporting that's required going into next year. But again, that's going to go through the license software. So you're not going to necessarily have to spend too much time on that. They've built to this program. So for software and licensing for 2021, they plan to open licensing up before the end of the year. It was supposed to be November 1st, but with most licensing procedures, there's always something that goes wrong. I just demoed the license software, and I don't know if there's any previous growers on here who filled out that PDF application this last year, but it is so much easier. It's a lot more straightforward. I think it took me about 20 minutes. It's a lot easier to use. So I think everyone's going to be much happier, and it'll be quicker and more straightforward to make changes. But there will be a fee for licensing in 2021. It'll be $750 if you're going to be a grower or a handler. So both are the same price. And then if you want to be a grower and a handler, that's $1,500. But what I will say, if you're processing your own hemp, you're not considered a handler. You only become a handler when you're actually touching and, processing, moving, drying other people's hemp. So if you have your own operation set up and you're vertically integrated, you're not going to have to pay $1,500. It'll just be that $750. If you want to expand your business and become a handler and work with, maybe your 2 hemp grower neighbors down the road, that's when you have to go in and pay that additional $750. And then there's also change fees. So if you go in and you want to add sites or change locations of fields or drying barns, or if you're processing, changing your buildings, they do include a $50 fee, and you have 20 hours to make all the changes you need. They also are requiring background checks. This isn't new, but it is for sure going to be through the FBI fingerprint background checks. You have to get it within 16 days of your application. So keep that in mind as well. That's the link on where to go for those background checks. There's been a lot of problems with growers actually finding the right link. So that's the one that the state chemist supplied to me. And then all the reports that go to USDA are built in. So you're, putting in your sites and your acreage and your variety information. So this essentially makes it so you don't have to fill out additional reports. And then there are acreage requirements. I wanted to put this in there because we're getting a lot of kind of backlash about the $750 fee. So the Midwest Hemp Council put together some fees for neighboring states, including Kentucky, Ohio, Michigan, Illinois, Missouri, and Wisconsin. And just a comparison, Kentucky and some of these other states break their fees up into specific sections. So they have, in Kentucky's example, uh, if you're gonna go through paper, it's a $200 paper application fee, and then per address. So if you have, multiple addresses, it's $400 per address. So Indiana doesn't have a charge for multiple field sites. And then if you want to change something in Kentucky, it's $750 per change. So if you were to change 4 sites, or I guess we'll do 2 sites for ease, that's $1,500, or 4 sites would be $3,000. So Kentucky's application can be really expensive. And the same thing is with, Ohio and Wisconsin. They have it broken up into multiple sections, which makes it, become much more expensive. So just keep that in mind. It's cost the state chemist a lot of money to run the hemp program for the last 2 years. I think at this point it's been at least $500,000 just to do all the testing that they haven't been able to recover. And so this is just to cover their staff and their testing fees, and the cost of building this software out. So just to give you kind of a frame of reference. So for the acreage requirements, this is important to know as well. If you are producing hemp for grain or seed or fiber, seed oil, anything that falls into, seed sown row crop production, you need 10 contiguous acres. That's the minimum. That's going to be grown, like a field or forage crop. If you're growing for cannabinoids, whether that's clones or cuttings, or you could do direct seedings, but specifically for CBD or other cannabinoids, that's 1 contiguous acre, including 1,500 plants as a minimum. The state chemist is not going to go out and count your plants. So if you plant 1,500 little seedlings and you lose, 300 of them because of root rots and insects or, whatever it may be, they're not going to go and penalize you for that. You just have to show in good faith that you started with 1,500 plants. If you're a breeding operation, you can't have more than 5 acres. This is the American Seed Association standard. We don't have a ton of seed breeders at this point in the state. And then for indoor growers, this could be a greenhouse, slat house, hoop house, controlled environment, warehouse style growing. You need 2,000 square feet, 1,500 plants if you're producing clones. This isn't 1,500 mature plants, or 300 mature plants. So if you're growing them out to maturity to harvest them for, CBD or CBG or whatever, those are your minimums. What I will say, we do have quite a few people who have hoop house production in the state. And if you have, 2,000 square foot hoop houses right next to each other, they're unique structures, but they're right near each other. That's been fine through the state chemist. So don't worry about that, if you have multiple hoop houses, but they're not just one contiguous 2,000 square feet. You're also going to need to identify key participants, but this has been a point of confusion. Key participants are going to be people that are, majorly involved in your business. So these could be supervisors, CEOs, CFOs, depending on the company you're working on, people who serve as like managers or in a role where they're superior. This isn't going to be people who are volunteering, hired labor. If you have to hire somebody a couple weeks to help with transplanting, these people don't need to go through that background check process, and they don't need to be listed as key participants. So keep that in mind when you go through this licensing. You don't need to list every single laborer you're going to hire throughout the summer. Don't worry about that. It's just the people that have a major role in the farm or in the company. And then there's also a role of certified crop advisors. So if you're a grower, you have the opportunity to work as a crop advisor for sampling the hemp. So the state chemist is going to have to contract out some of their sampling because they're not going to be able to go to every single field and collect hemp for compliancy testing. So CCAs have the option to be trained by the state chemist and then work with third-party labs and farmers to do that mandatory compliancy testing. So this isn't self-monitoring before you contact the state to let them know you're, going to harvest your hemp in 15 days. This is for the mandatory testing that has to be reported to the state. So this list is going to be available by the state chemist office, and they'll let you know once you've gone through the application process who these CCAs are, and what third labs that you can work with. But this is just something to keep in mind as well. If you work with CCAs, lots of extension educators are CCAs, and are interested in serving in this role. So it makes some growers feel more comfortable knowing, exactly who's going to sample their hemp. Now I want to get into some production basics. I'm going to talk about grain fiber and CBD production. If some of you have already seen this, I apologize. I tried to include new information and survey data, but I'll just get right through it. So we have general planting and harvest windows. I broke it up into CBD and then grain and fiber. These are just ballpark estimates because we're still trying to figure out what's going to be best for Indiana. And as many of you know, we have, 3 kind of climate regions, so it's going to vary based on where you are. I'm assuming a lot of you are Clay and Owen County. But if you're not, you may have to modify this. Last year, 72% of the hemp was planted in June and July. This is a lot of people transplanting hemp, but we even had some grain growers sowing their seed June 27th, which is far too late to have a really good crop we've seen when you're planting from direct seeding. And then most of the hemp last year was harvested in September and October. We saw that to be true this year as well. We had a lot more late July planting this year. We don't have survey data back yet, but a lot of growers kind of jumped on last minute and decided they wanted to produce hemp. And so they had, a delay in when they could get their clones, and they set the plants just far too late. And so that likely affected their yield. So last year we had a lot of issues due to weather. This was mostly abundant rainfall in May and June. This year, I would say most of the delays in planting were due to new growers not securing seeds or clones early on. People feeling uncertain because of COVID, maybe not being able to find laborers to help transplant. So there were some other issues. I mean, there were still some weather issues that we saw this year. But last year, too much rainfall just prevented growers from getting in the field. Which brings me to site selection. Site selection is really important with this crop. We say this a lot, that hemp doesn't like wet feet, but it's really true. This is from the research farm just south of Purdue's campus. And this is a low area where we tend to get a lot of flooding. Hemp doesn't do well. It usually gets outcompeted by weeds. We see a lot of damping off from Pythium, which I'll talk about later. But site selection is a really, important to start off on the right foot. Clay dominant or really heavy soils, compacted soils, don't work very well for hemp if you're direct seeding. If you're transplanting on raised beds, you do have a little bit of leeway. But in general, we say, choose your best field sites, choose fertile field sites. There's a misconception that hemp can just grow anywhere well, and it can grow lots of different places. I mean, we call it ditchweed, it grows on field margins. It can grow in unfavorable sites, but that doesn't mean you're going to achieve optimal yield. Just like if you're growing any other crop, you're going to want to choose a really suitable site. And then, of course, choosing a field site where the history, soil pathogens have been a problem that we've seen from direct seeded hemp. This year, we also saw a lot of transplanted hemp with Pythium and Fusarium. So we saw lots of root rots with transplanted hemp, lots of root girdling this year from delayed plantings. So understand your field history. Most of the hemp last year, if it was seeds, were planted by hand. I'll talk about it in a second. But with grain drills, row crop planters, we had air seeders. I saw a really nice stand of hemp that was planted with a brilliant seeder. Our fiber growers like to broadcast. Transplanting is mostly occurring by hand. There are people who are using water wheel transplanters, which is obviously more efficient. And then for the seed planting method by hand, I think there's people who bought feminized seed and they were planting either seedlings, and so they just considered that seeds because they started them from seeds, or they were dropping seeds in the ground, but they're planting at a density of 1,500 plants per acre. But for our row crop producers, they're using mechanized planters. Fertility is one of the things we're trying to understand more, and we're trying to work with A&L Great Lakes and Fort Wayne, who's worked with a lot of hemp growers and have has worked with us. But we're trying to figure out a good fertility program. I put Canadian baselines. I converted them from kilograms a hectare to pounds per acre. And what we saw from our survey of what growers actually applied. So they are on the low end of what Canadian recommendations are. And again, this is just based off of what they applied, not what they started with. They could have been in fields with a lot of organic matter that had, high nitrogen content. We're seeing, phosphorus recommendations a little bit higher than Canadian recommendations. Potassium a little bit higher, but they are kind of matching up pretty closely with what Canada is doing. And for those of you that don't know, Canada's been producing hemp for grain and oil seed since the mid 90s. So they do have more information, but they are working with different soils, usually a little drier where they're growing hemp than it is in Indiana. And then we didn't ask growers about sulfur applications, but hemp does do well with some sulfur, and we have seen some sulfur deficiencies. So when you produce hemp for grain or for seed, you're seeding at 20 to 40 pounds per acre. Again, grain drill, Brilliant seeder, corn planter were all common methods. This photo is of a maturing hemp plant produced specifically for grain. This is a variety called X59 or the hemp nut, which has been bred in Canada. We're looking at a depth target of 1/4 to 3/4 of an inch. It depends on your planter. Some some are a lot more precise, but in general, the seed is pretty small and it doesn't do well in deeper plantings especially when it's wet. If it's a little bit drier, you have sandier soils, you can plant deeper. But especially with X59 in particular, it's a pretty big seed, and it seems to just be a really good host for some of these root rots. Our plant pathologist has made that observation over the last 4 years. And then because it doesn't do well in really wet soils and saturated soils, we say plant after rain, not before. If you get a big flood event or washing out, your seeds can get washed out, or they just sit there and they don't germinate and get taken over by pathogens. This is a photo I took this year of a grower combining. He had a 20-foot header on, and then he was taking his hemp to his drying bin. He's drying it pretty quickly. You need to dry it within 4 to 6 hours of when you harvest. This is a really hot day as well, so you don't want the seeds to sweat, so they're immediately putting it in the aerated bin to dry down. This was in mid-October when he was harvesting. Just give you an idea of, how they're harvesting. He's using equipment that he's had for his other row crops. When we look at grain yields from last year, most of the growers, even though there weren't very many, were producing over 700 pounds per acre. And almost all of them were producing X59. They worked with one specific seed distributor in Wisconsin called Legacy Hemp. So we were really happy, and we just have over 700 pounds. But when we talk to the actual growers, some of the bigger ones, they're in the 900 to 1,200 pounds per acre, which is pretty close to what they're producing in Canada. And so we're working with a genetic that has been bred for a specific region. It tends to flower earlier here than in Canada. We're still getting comparable yields. So we think grain hemp does have promise, even though I mentioned at the very beginning, it's the least amount of acres produced in the state. Our growers do have the capability of producing comparable yields, and it does pretty well here. So that's exciting. When we look at prices, though, from last year, on the low end, we have 55 cents a pound. On the high end for certified organic, we have $1.25 per pound. University of Kentucky has a cost of production estimate, and they put it about 400 pounds per acre. So I think when I calculated it out, that's a net of 200 to 300 pounds per acre for some of our growers last year. But this doesn't include that $750 license cost. But that's just a flat fee. It's not with additional acres. So just keep that in mind if you're interested in grain or fiber. The seeds are 30 to 40% oil. We do have a cold press oil company in Converse, Amboy area of Indiana called Healthy Hoosier Oil. And he's been really happy with his hemp oil, and it does a really nice job in his, standard sunflower canola press. And then to give you an idea, if you are going to look into this more and you see, how many bushels are produced per acre, it's about 44 pounds per bushel. Because I know with other crops, it's in bushel rather than in a straight pound. So just to give you an idea of what bushel weight is. I mentioned we have fiber production in the state of Indiana. Unfortunately, we don't have any fiber processing online in the state or even in northern Kentucky anymore at this point. We did still have people produce with the hope that there would be a processor online, and unfortunately that didn't really work out. So our growers who produced last year and some who produced this year are going to ship it out of state. Some of them are working with a processor in Pennsylvania. But for fiber, you're going to seed it at about double the rate of what you would for grain, 50 to 70 pounds per acre. That top photo is one of the fields we worked with last year at the Southwest Purdue Ag Center research farm. And you can see how close together those plants are. You want a really dense seeding rate because the plants will grow tall and thin, and you'll achieve a good ratio of the outer fiber to the inner fiber. We used a grain drill on the research farm, but broadcast planting was pretty common among fiber growers last year. And then the same recommendation on the depth and then planting after rain for fiber. You're going to follow most of the recommendations similar to grain when it comes to, depth and overall management. This is from the Southwest Purdue Ag Center. We just use a sickle mower to harvest it. You can see kind of the lines between the plots. So we had small replicated plots to do a seeding rate by nitrogen study. And then the photo on the top left are those plots left out to go through a drying or retting process, which I'll tell you about in a second. Last year, growers were going to get 8 cents per pound of dry stock material, or $160 per ton. This was for a specific contract with a company in northern Kentucky. So most of the growers were in southern Indiana. So they didn't have to ship as far because they do have to absorb the shipping costs. That's not paid for by the processor. For cost of production estimates, Kentucky puts it at $486 because that does factor in transportation, and then you're seeding at a higher rate, so your seed costs are going to be higher than grain hemp. When you look at the stock material, the photo more to the left shows you the outer fiber. That's going to be what's used for textile production or composite material. And then that inner material is kind of pithy or woody. It's very absorbent. People are looking at chipping it and mixing it with concrete to make building materials. But when you look at an actual stock, only 20 to 30% of that material is fiber usable for textiles or that composite material. And then you have to go through a decortication process. So we need to have processing in close proximity to our growers to make this a realistic crop to produce. Most of our growers last year were producing less than 5 tons of biomass per acre. The main reason for this last year was late planting. So if you plant hemp a lot earlier, you give it more time to grow tall, you can have more biomass accumulation. And then weed management was an issue. We don't have any herbicides labeled for use in hemp. Growers didn't have necessarily the cleanest fields when they planted their hemp, so they just couldn't get ahead of the weeds. So hopefully if we do have processing go online in the state, now that we do know more about how fiber hemp grows in Indiana, and just the issues we've had with weed management and making sure we plant really early, looking at end of April, May timeframe, hopefully yields can go up. And then for the fiber decortication, you have to go through a retting process. This can be a dew, a chemical, or a water ret. In the state of Indiana, growers went through a dew ret. This is where you leave the stock material in the field for 15 days to several months, depending on the amount of rainfall or water that's present in the field. And it's not necessarily a rot process or a dry process. This is kind of a combination of both. The outer fiber, the bast that I showed you in that photo before, is connected to the inner fiber by pectin. And pectin essentially needs to be dissolved or eaten away, and microbes and water help break down that connection. So then when you do go through the decortication process, the crimpers and the paddles can separate the material so you can get a usable fiber, and then you can get that remaining hurd that can be used for other materials. So compared to other bast fibers, so flax, calf, jute, are all grown similarly and processed similarly. It tends to be longer, so you get these really long fibers that are extremely strong and durable. The inner material is very absorbent, and then there are some anti-mildew and antimicrobial properties that they're starting to see. So in general, it is a pretty desirable material for composites in particular, but it can be difficult to work with and it's really expensive to import from Europe. And then lastly, I'll talk about cannabinoids, and then the end I'll just talk about pest management and pesticides. But growers are planting on the minimum 1,500 plants per acre, up to 2,500 plants. I have a webinar I put on the Purdue Hemp Extension Specialist YouTube channel that talks about novel CBD production, where you produce it as a row crop, so your plant density is much higher. So if you're interested in that, that's available for free online. It's a pretty cool production model, but most of the growers in the state are producing in a horticultural or plasticulture model. So they're transplanting seedlings or clones using a water wheel or tobacco setter or by hand. Saw a lot of hand transplanting last year and this year. And then when I say horticulture model, it's more like tomatoes or watermelon or your vegetables where they're on raised beds. Some decide to lay plastic or some kind of mulch, and then they typically have trickle tape or drip irrigation. These are just some of the different fields around the state of Indiana to give you an idea of the different types of production we see. So these are all still horticultural models, but we have two that have plastic, both white and black plastic. We have one that has nothing, so no irrigation, no plastic, no raised beds. And then we have on the bottom raised bed, and they have trickle tape laid. They don't like to do plastic on their farm. So there's no perfect way to produce the crop. I like to tell growers, work with what's best in your operation. Don't go out and buy a bed shaper, plastic layer, transplanter right out to the start. See if you can rent or borrow the equipment. Work with what you have to start. I think that's super important. If you already are, a vegetable melon producer and you have some of this equipment, it works fine for hemp production, and you might see a really easy, integration of this crop as a rotation, but just figure out what works best for you. For biomass production last year, we have a range of what was produced on the low end, less than 500 pounds per acre. And then we did have some growers that were above 1,500 pounds per acre, which is really great. I'm going to share with you an enterprise budget model link, which gives you break even for different yields per acre and CBD content. And so this gives you an idea of what growers saw last year. Hopefully this year yield was higher because we did have some, second year growers producing. But what we don't have is a correlation between the biomass and their CBD content. We have them separated. So we ask them, how much CBD are you producing? What was your yield? Which is important because you get paid not based on just how many pounds per acre produced, but the actual CBD content of that material. So we have most growers producing between 6 to 9%, and then some above 10%, but a lot of those growers are non-compliant when it comes to THC. Generally, we've seen once you get to 12% CBD, you're almost 100% above the 0.3% THC threshold. There's also a worry among Indiana growers about going to seed. In a CBD system, you're typically feminized, you're all female, you don't want any male, pollen floating around, whether that's within your field or a neighboring farm. And we did have about 54% of our growers go to seed. That could be a couple seeds per plant or fully seeded out. But we do have grain and fiber production in the state, and we can't tell one grower that, they can produce CBD, but their neighbor can't produce fiber. So I think it's important to talk to your neighbors, be involved in the hemp community if you want to grow, so you can get an idea of who may be growing around you and what they're growing. So you can prepare yourself for, potential pollination or see how you could choose a different field site to separate yourself more. And then for CBD production, harvesting, drying, and processing are also really important to think about ahead of time. Most of our growers hand harvested, but there are mechanized harvesters. Oxbow, which has lots of specialty crop harvesters, has a super hemp harvester, which I think harvests 4 rows at a time, which is pretty cool. Kirby produces a harvester. They're a tobacco harvesting company that mechanizes that cutting process, but most of growers are going around with, metal weed eaters, some kind of, metal saw, and they're cutting these plants because they're, almost like little shrubs or trees. They have pretty thick stems. And they're pretty woody. it's very difficult to use pruners or loppers to cut them. I tried that this year. And then most of our growers are hang drying in barns with, reduced humidity, increased air circulation. This is a photo from a mechanical drying facility that was operational last year in Kokomo. They're no longer online for, drying services, but there is a mechanical dryer in Hartford City through a company called Heartland Harvest. So if you, do want to go the mechanical drying route, there is a place that mechanically dries, and I don't foresee them going out of business. But it's a similar process where your material goes on a conveyor belt, and they have kind of like an oven system where it blows, some low heat air on the material to increase drying, and then they can put them in super sacks. And then craft flower smokable hemp market obviously is not available at this point, and I said don't bank on that, but do keep your eye out on, potential legal changes in the future. When smokable hemp was first banned, there was a group of growers and lawyers that challenged that, and they got a temporary injunction through a federal judge. And so we did have smokable hemp for most of last winter and part of the summer, and then Indiana ruled based on the language that they could in fact ban smokable hemp. But if that was what you really wanted to do and you're really interested in that market, like I said, don't bank on it at this point, but definitely keep your, eyes on changes in the regulatory framework for smokable hemp, because it could possibly change. There are a lot of people fighting to have this market open up in the state again. For processing and testing, if you're growing for cannabinoids, this is going to be super important. We finally have a list of online CBD processors in the state of Indiana, and you can find them on that link. It's a PDF I put together, and it's 10 questions to ask yourself if you're growing or, someone who's thinking about growing. And so you can go through all those questions. There's a lot of great links. But if you go to the very last 2 pages, you can see CBD processors in the state, what kind of contracts or processing agreements they will enter into, how they extract. So we have ethanol extraction, hexane extraction, butane extraction, I think maybe pentane, supercritical CO2. So check that out. Finally, we were able to get CBD processors to give us all the information. And then I also have a PDF on the PurdueHemp.org website that has some third-party labs that I think all have their DEA licenses now and have worked with Indiana growers. And this year did offer some discounts in pricing to people who either worked with somebody at Purdue, which were most of our growers, or were part of Midwest Hemp Council. I don't have a recommendation of one lab over the other, but the ones I have listed are reputable and have been great to work with. So on the producing for cannabinoid economic side of things, I mentioned they break down based on percentage. So you have a price per percentage point per pound. The last I heard, it was 44 cents per percentage point per pound. So if you're at 10% CBD and you have a pound of dry material, that makes your plant or your pound of material $4.40. If that's 1,500 plants, bare minimum, that's $6,600 per acre. It sounds pretty good, but when we look at cost of production models from University of Kentucky and University of Tennessee, there's quite a range in how expensive it can be to produce this plant. So if you're at the low end, that's actually a pretty good return. If you're at that high end, you're losing a lot of money. So figure out what production model you kind of want to go under, and then figure out how much labor you're going to need. That's a big one. A lot of growers spend a lot more than what they anticipated just in labor costs. So that's one that I would say maybe overshoot on, because that's what I hear about the most of, hiring labor to plant, to scout the field for males, to weed management's been a problem in CBD hemp. And then harvest. Harvest can be quite time consuming if you're doing it by hand. And then the price has decreased since spring. This, you don't have to read these slides. It was just something Hemp Benchmark sent me. This is a company that does provide monthly reports on hemp pricing, not just biomass, but also on crude and CBD isolate and CBG and lots of other things. They're pretty good reports. However, they do charge a fee. So I'd say, you know, if there are a group of people that are all friends, maybe pool some money together to subscribe to this. There's also one called Pan Exchange that does monthly reports that I think is a little cheaper. So this is just a change in pricing starting from April all the way to August. So you can just see month to month. You don't have to focus on the actual numbers, but you can see there's a negative change in all aspects of CBD material, whether that's biomass, seeds, CBD isolate. So we just have seen a decrease this year alone. We saw a big decrease last year from $4 a percentage point in April to $1 percentage point in November. So, you know, we knew it wasn't going to be sustainable to stay at $4 a percentage point. For processors, it just wasn't going to be sustainable, but cost of production is a lot. It's much too high to, you know, actually make money. If you're going to spend $15,000 an acre and it's only 44 cents a percentage point, you're going to not want to grow the next year. So we have to figure out, you know, a happy medium for production costs. There are enterprise budget models that I like to use. There are a lot out there. University of Kentucky's is probably one of my favorite. So if you go to this link, they list a bunch of different departments that are involved in hemp. Go specifically to the agricultural economics section, and you can download this Excel document so you can go in and make changes for your cost of production. You can go line by line, make sure you change the licensing fee to what ours is in Indiana. And you can see, you know, cost of production. You can put in, you know, estimates on what you think your yields could be. And they have multiple production models for CBD. I think they have at least 4. They also have grain production models and fiber production models. So you get the most bang for your buck free, but you get the most out of this one Excel document. So it's probably one of my favorite, but go line by line and figure out your own costs specific to your operation, of course. And then University of Tennessee also does have a really good production model, but it's specific to the more horticultural kind of intense production model. So lastly, I'm just going to go over pest management quickly because I know we're running out of time. So we do have pesticide options because we have pests. We have pest problems that we've encountered in hemp. This year we found downy mildew for the first time in hemp in Indiana. Sometimes we find new insects in hemp. I found Eurasian hemp borer for the first time affecting commercial CBD fields. So because we're seeing, you know, insect and pathogen problems and weed problems, we do have pesticide options available. This is just a snippet of the list. Most of the products, though, they're Section 3, so they're registered through the EPA and through the state, but they're biopesticides, so they're not going to necessarily have the efficacy you're used to for other commercial crop production. But some of them are, you know, fairly effective. They're better than doing nothing in some cases, especially with pests like corn earworm. So that link will take you to the PDF that explains a bunch of information about pesticide applications in hemp, and then gives you a great long list of Section 3, 24C, and 25B products, and explains kind of what each of those sections mean. So if you're going to grow, this is something to become familiar with, just so you can see your product options. And then I also like to bring up homebrew pesticides, especially with hemp. You know, there are a lot of forums, cannabis growing forums online, and some of the information is okay, but a lot of it, you know, are recipes for aphids or for powdery mildew, and they're crazy concoctions that can burn or damage your plants. They're not necessarily effective. So this is an example of a homemade concoction sprayed on a CBD hemp plant that burned the plant. It didn't get rid of the aphids. And then there's the potential concern of adulterating products. So when you go through processing, you know, are you going to have anything show up on pesticide residue, you know, panels that the extraction companies run? That's a concern. We don't want to adulterate products. We don't want anybody to get sick. And they're prohibited in most states, including Indiana. So just keep that in mind. again, we don't know how effective they are anyway. So if you're making your own blend of things, just be aware of the risks of doing that. So when we look at commonly observed insects in the state, this is based off survey data. We have corn earworm feeding on maturing flowers and seeds. Our primary stalk borer is European corn borer. We have lots of leaf feeders. This is a zebra caterpillar, but we see fall armyworm, variegated cutworm, salt marsh caterpillar, pretty much anything. A lot of things we found on hemp. The primary fluid sucker is cannabis aphid, which is a specialist on cannabis plants. But we also see lots of beneficial insects, including lady beetles, which eat those cannabis aphids. So we see tons and tons of beneficial insects in hemp fields. The state chemist has our 2019 grower survey reports. And I put together some figures of the beneficial insects that growers are seeing. So that's available if you want to look at, the primary beneficials in hemp fields. I also listed some additional pests. We saw common stalk borer this year, Eurasian hemp borer, spotted cucumber beetle and flea beetles are common, stink bugs, plant bugs, potato leafhopper, spider mites. This isn't a complete list. We see all kinds of things in hemp. Some are just hanging out, some are actually feeding but doing minimal damage, and then some are particularly concerning. The ones I have bolded are ones that are of concern economically, but for time's sake, I'll just kind of breeze over those and show you some pictures. Corn earworm is one that is concerning because it feeds on the marketable portion of the plant and can cause quite a bit of damage. Right now, we're just working on the trapping network. So Purdue has a great corn earworm trapping network where they have placed these pheromone traps in sweet corn around the state, and this year they also place them in hemp. So that link will take you to trap catches, and it distinguishes corn or hemp. So this is an option for growers. You can put these traps out and monitor flights. And that's helpful for management because we have BT and viruses available for use, and you really want to rely on that trap catch data to make your applications. And if you are curious about learning more about this, I can talk to you directly and we'll talk more about biopesticides. This year we had a lot of growers manually picking off caterpillars, which sounds crazy, but if you have a small operation and you see big juicy caterpillars, those biopesticides aren't necessarily going to be very effective. And at that point, you're already out in the field. People are just pulling them, throwing them in ethanol or squishing them, doing whatever. Eurasian hemp borer is concerning because it causes damage to the plant similar to corn earworm, but it's completely within stalk or stem material. So this is how I try to find them in the field. I look for brown material, I pop it open, and there is a little Eurasian hemp borer caterpillar on my tiny fingers. It's about 6 millimeters long, so they're itty bitty. This is one that's been mostly isolated to Northwest Indiana. But the biggest problem for this pest is we don't understand much about it. I found it last year, May 27th, and then adults, and then I found larvae June 8th. So we're just trying to figure out how many generations they have per year, what alternate hosts they may have. They may use hops or Japanese knotweed, but we know for sure they're in feral hemp populations. And I know there's feral hemp all over the state. I just know specific populations in northern Indiana, so that's where I go. But if you are a grower or a prospective grower and you know there might be feral hemp by you, this could be a potential pest that could move into your hemp. We don't understand much about the life history, and we have no pheromone lures developed, so we can't monitor this pest like we could corn earworm or European corn borer. It's caused a lot more economic loss in Illinois and Wisconsin. That's where I hear about it much more. I have a friend who's a crop consultant in Illinois, and he's seen it all over the state. It's been uncontrollable at this point with any kind of insecticide. In Indiana, it's more minor, it's isolated fields, but we are seeing it cause damage. But growers, especially CBD growers, have this tendency to stockpile hemp stalks after they've bucked the flowers. They remove the flowers to go to a processor, and then they leave the stock material and they just accumulate it, and they have this big stockpile all winter. And we do know for sure that this pest will overwinter as a fully mature caterpillar and then pupate in the spring and emerge as an adult where it can reinfest your hemp. So this is something that is a great management practice, is just remove that plant debris, chop it up, figure out a buyer, just get it away from what we plan to grow next year. And then lastly, before I quickly go through pathogens and then weeds, potato leafhopper has been a problem for a few of our growers. This was from this year. I have a photo from last year on the next slide. But it does cause hopper burn like what we see in alfalfa or on hops. The biggest problem we've seen are other neighboring crops. So this particular farm from last year was right next to organic alfalfa. So every time he cut his alfalfa, he'd have this surge of potato leafhopper. So this is important too. Note other neighboring crops, which is important for herbicide drift as well, for people around corn and bean growers. And then, of course, scouting is super important, not just for this pest, but in general. So I always want growers to look for scorching, sweep and look for nymphs and adults. And then we're looking at cultivar selection or variety selection. Just like with alfalfa, we have resistant or tolerant varieties. We're looking at that for hemp as well. We've seen two that seem to be really susceptible. One, ironically called Midwestern strain, and then another one called Wu 5 that get hit really hard and have really bad hopper burn. And you can see that plant there looks kind of deformed and stunted. It just doesn't look right. So that's kind of what we're looking at for control options for this one at this point. Diseases have been a really big problem. Unfortunately, we have some grad students in the Department of Botany and Plant Pathology working on hemp and looking at some of these, but we have lots of root rots like Pythium and Fusarium. I didn't put it here, but Rhizoctonia is another really bad one. Cercospora leaf spot, Septoria, Phoma, and hemp leaf spot are also really common. We see Cercospora and Phoma a lot in hemp. And then we see a lot of powdery mildew when we have damp gray weather, which we had in the end of August this year. We see bud rot, which sometimes is caused by botrytis. That's what we've seen. Then we see white mold and southern blight. And I'll talk about these a little bit and some management quickly. Pythium has been, like I said earlier, a huge problem when we have really wet conditions. So tiling fields is one way to help reduce that saturation. Planting on fields with good drainage, avoiding areas that were in other crops that were susceptible and you actually saw Pythium. I know not, everyone is going to actually have fields that have a history of some of these root rots and these diseases. But, if you know you have a problem with Pythium or white mold or southern blight, it's just generally good to avoid them because hemp is really susceptible. We don't have seed treatments at this point. If you're direct seeding, we don't have really any treatments that are effective on some of these particular diseases. White mold is another one that we've seen, but really more in the mid or northern part of the state. So I won't spend too much time on this, but this is a photo of a plant that had pretty bad white mold. Again, rotation is really important for this particular pathogen, undisturbed field. So if you had, struggled with white mold 5 years ago and your field was undisturbed, there's probably a good chance that you're not going to necessarily have white mold affect your hemp plants. But you just want to keep that in mind. Field history is super important, and weed control is important just for pathogen prevention, but also to, help produce the healthiest plants possible. Southern blight was a problem, but in the Evansville area, the biggest thing for this one is once you have southern blight in the field, it can be really hard to get rid of. So if you see plants affected, remove all the plant material and the soil surrounding them. That's what this grower unfortunately had to do. This particular photo is from Tennessee, but we have a photo similar. He had to just remove whole plants in the surrounding soil and bag them up and take them out of the field. Sanitation is really important, not just for southern blight, but also for movement of pests. And weed seeds. Good sanitation, like I said, limited pesticide options, look at other integrated pest management techniques. Powdery mildew is one this year that was a problem. If anybody's interested in indoor production, this is one you're likely going to see more often, especially if you're growing year round. I saw a lot of powdery mildew in February of last year in a glass house. But when you're producing for grain and fiber, you have a lot of pollen production, which on the photo on the right, it almost looks like powdery mildew, but that's just pollen. So diagnosis is really important. There are a couple fungicides on the list on the state chemist website labeled specifically for powdery mildew. So you want to make sure you're diagnosing. Like this photo, this is powdery mildew. We're trying to figure out resistant cultivars. I think University of Tennessee just put out a publication with a bunch of resistant cultivars to powdery mildew, or at least somewhat resistant. You'd be surprised how many hemp growers plant in shaded areas. I've seen a lot of hemp planted under big hardwood trees. That's a really good environment for powdery mildew. Pruning can be an important way to help air circulation. Growers also opt to prune to try to help, remove dying branches or unproductive leaves in the lower part of the canopy. So you may do that anyway. It helps reduce pathogen movement. And then when you're scouting, removing infected leaves and throw them in a bag is a really good tactic. Botrytis is probably one of the more concerning pathogens because it affects late season. So you could be growing a really beautiful crop, and then all of a sudden you get hit with bud rot or bud blast, and it's very damaging. Your crops are not necessarily salvageable, like you can see in that photo. That bud is pretty much completely destroyed. You're not going to be able to send that to a processor. So rapid drying is important. The number one thing is don't overhead irrigate when you have flower or seed head production. So once you go into that, if you have overhead irrigation, stop. That's when we see a lot of mold growth within the buds themselves. That was a problem for some of our growers last year. And then of course, try to prevent movement of inoculum. So wait until dew has dried off. We also see some insect damage lead to secondary infection, which isn't necessarily botrytis, but you'll see some kinds of mold growth. So sometimes managing those pests like corn earworm, you're also going to manage, bud rot or bud blast by managing those caterpillars. And then lastly, I only have a couple slides on this because we don't have a ton of weed management recommendations, but we do have growers seeing lots of different, including velvet leaf, giant ragweed, pigweed, and giant foxtail. And then lots of other weeds. Johnson grass is pretty common. We saw a ton of purslane last year, water hemp, morning glory, cocklebur. So we see all kinds of weeds in the hemp field. I mentioned earlier, we don't have herbicide options. We technically have two, but not two really effective ones. So we do tend to see an explosion of weeds in some of the fields, especially if they were fallow for, several years. So hemp is a pretty slow grower in the beginning of the season. In the first 3 to 4 weeks, especially if it's kind of cool and wet, hemp's not competitive. So the bottom photo is, early in the season. You can see some common ragweed popping up there. There's some velvet leaf seedlings coming up as well. This is within the first 3 weeks. And then the top photo is after canopy closure. And it's clean in the understory. These are fiber specific cultivars where you're seeding, really densely. And so you do achieve faster canopy closure. But that's really important, managing weeds until you get that canopy closure. With CBD plants, until you get, a bushier structure, you're going to want to manage those weeds. Controlling weeds before planting is important. You can't technically do a burn down in the state of Indiana once that field is registered for hemp. So you register those specific GPS locations. But they're thinking about maybe changing that and allowing some products for burn down. But you could manage the weeds in the fall. You could manage the weeds by planting other crops in the field in the previous year. So think about that when you're picking field sites. Think about how bad the weed pressure has been, what the seed bank might look like. And then we do have 2 herbicide options. These are going to be specific for CBD growers. They're vinegar or acetic acid based products, and they're between row only. So it's a horticulture model where you have, 2 foot or more spacing where you're not going to get any drift and burn those plants, where you can just directly apply the herbicide to the weeds between the row. You're not going to use it in grain production or fiber production or row crop CBD production. And they don't work on really big weeds, just like most herbicides. You might burn the plant a little bit, but it's not going to kill it. We have growers who are mechanically weeding. Cultivation is obviously pretty pretty common. We had some growers plant wider row spacing for grain to try to get cultivation equipment, and they thought it kind of between the rows, and they thought it kind of damaged the plants. But there are all kinds of like nifty vegetable weeders that you can use tines to get between the plants that we had organic producers use for hemp, and they work great. So for any vegetable producers that have weed management techniques down, they work for hemp just fine once the plants are, still small. And then plasticulture is one way to manage weeds, or any kind of mulch for CBD production. Otherwise, hand labor is going to be your main means of controlling weeds in CBD production, so you can, maximize your yields. These are some additional links for resources, including the link that goes directly to the OISC hemp site, our Purdue hemp site, USDA information in Kentucky, Wisconsin, and MSU, since they're border states. Ohio doesn't have a ton of information, but these other sites do. We have a great team of people who work on this. These are people that are working at the university, but we also have educators like Bob Bruner, Valerie Klingerman, Kenny Eck are some that come to mind immediately. We have a ton of great educators, Ashley Adair, that are working with hemp growers and working on research and, resources for hemp growers. So I really appreciate all their hard work. And here's some contact information. This is our website. There's a lot of really cool information that we've updated on there. And if there's any questions in the chat, I would be happy to take them.
All right, I don't see any questions yet, but feel free to put them in there. Or if you guys want, just go ahead and unmute if you just want to ask them out loud. That's just fine.